Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Common Law. I am your host, Ed Berkman. Now, I am an attorney in both Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Now, although I am an attorney, I am not your attorney. So please, anything that you hear on this program or any of the other programs you may be watching, don't consider any of the material here legal advice. Legal issues are very case specific. Your specific issue, although it might sound similar to something that we're talking about, I assure you that it is not. And sort of the devil is in the details with that. So if you do have a legal question, my email is on the screen, and reach out and I'd be more than happy to answer your specific legal question. But again, do not consider anything on the program here legal advice. It's really just food for thought. Now, in today's topic, we are going to talk about ADUs, otherwise known as additional dwelling units. These can go by other names as well. Some people call them in-law apartments. Some people call them granny flats. They're sort of just an additional area where, you might be able to rent it out or have family come live by. Now, we all know there was a housing crisis, so the state of Massachusetts set a new law that sort of eases some of the restrictions on these additional dwelling units. Now, before, each city and town municipalities, they all had their own laws that they would use to sort of govern how these work. Some of the restrictions were that they couldn't have their own private entrance or exit, which basically forces them to go through the front door. Other cities and towns would require you to actually live there, so you couldn't put an ADU on something that was considered an income property for you, something that you were just renting out. And that's really what we're trying to do here, is expand the housing market and give, ease up on sort of the prohibitory nature and the expense that housing has right now. I think, and also a key factor in this is, these are a really great way to increase your property value, give you some more space, and it's to provide, I think, some families with some options here in terms of, if you have, your parents are getting older family members, and they need somebody to take care of them. Healthcare and long-term care expenses are astronomical right now, and they're only going to get more expensive. So I do think we are going to see more and more people choose to sort of live with family as opposed to going to a nursing home. And if that were to happen, these ADU laws, give more freedom to everybody. So with that out of the way, let's kind of break this down and kind of get into what this law changes and how this might be beneficial for you. So as we talked about, an ADU is a self-contained living unit, a bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen, located on the same lot as a primary dwelling. This could be internal, like we said, in a basement or an attic or a different section of the house, or it could be detached. Can think of it like a cottage, garage conversion, a shed conversion. A lot of times they have those, what are they, like shipping containers that they'll turn into like a dwelling, some sort of like, I've seen them be campers, things like that. It does have to be permanent. You can't just throw a camper on there. That's something you should know. And again, we're trying to just make this more accessible for everybody. Now, this law was called the Affordable Homes Act, and that was signed in August of 2024 by Governor Healy, and that went into effect in April of 2024. So we're almost to a year of this being, enforced. Now, I will say, anytime there is a new law sort of on the books, it does take some time to kind of figure out how these things are going to work in terms of how, and we'll get into that a little further on in terms of, what the municipalities can restrict and, what they can't anymore. So it kind of will get into a bit of a tug of war, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit later. So some of the exceptions here we should talk about is towns can impose restrictions on short-term rentals. So that's one thing those towns can still do. A lot of times they will ban, 30-day rentals or under 30-day rentals. And what's that aimed at? It's obviously aimed at, websites that offer those sort of deals. I'm sure if you Google short-term rental, you'll get a bunch of them that you can use, and they'll have these listings that you can rent out a house for a weekend or an apartment for a day or a night. I think we all know what we're talking about with that. Another thing this towns and this law doesn't change is section Title 5, septic systems. Obviously, if you have a 4-bedroom house and you have a 4-bedroom septic system and you build an ADU that has even just one additional bedroom in it, that bedroom counts as that bedroom for that septic system. So you would be over it, so you would need to upgrade that septic system unit. Now, let's get into actually, while we're talking about adding bedrooms, is ADUs will, or they should, increase your property value. You're adding square footage to your dwelling. You are adding bedrooms and bathrooms. So the value of your home will go up. Now that also means your taxes could go up. Something to keep in mind if, again, this is why we say this is not a one-size-fits-all program. We're just breaking down this law. If you have a specific question, please reach out. I'd be more than happy to answer it. Now, the municipalities can also still handle their sort of reviews for health code and building codes. They can impose, zoning ordinances and things like that. They're not. You just can't go wild on it. You are still under some restrictions here. The law basically says the restriction is it has to be smaller than 1/2 of your floor plan. So take your house, cut it in half. If you have a 1,500 square foot house, it can't be more than 750 square feet. It also can't be, or the other side of that coin is it can't be bigger than 900 square feet. So even if you have a massive house, it can't be bigger than 900 square feet. It must have its own separate entrance. So you can't just go through the front door. It has to be separate. And it should have parking spots. Now, if you're close to a train station or subway station, that I don't believe that restriction is needed. So you won't necessarily need a parking space in those instances. And while we're talking about the parking, let's talk about Boston. Boston is sort of exempt from this law. So Boston kind of does their own thing. I think we all kind of understand that. There's so many apartments and multifamily housing and big condos, and parking's a nightmare in Boston as well. So I think we all kind of understand that. Now, one thing the law says is that the municipalities cannot unreasonably restrict the creation of the rental or the ADU as long as it's not a short-term rental. Now, let's talk what is unreasonable, and that's sort of what we talk about when we talk about new laws. And that's why we kind of don't know how it's really all going to shake out right now. Basically, what needs to happen is somebody needs to kind of push the boundaries on what an ADU can and should be, and then that town is going to restrict that and say, no, you can't do that, either through zoning ordinance or something of that nature. And then that person will sue the town. Now the town can also sue the homeowner. It can go both ways. And that needs to sort of be settled in court. You can't just sue the town or have the town sue you and you guys settle outside of court. It has to be determined by a judge. And now we kind of have a better blueprint on sort of how this law will be viewed and enforced going forward. And that's sort of how we set laws in this country. It's legal precedent. Sure, if you watch some of the news shows, they kind of break that down. I think there's a lot in current events right now in terms of how laws are enforced and interpreted, even by the United States Supreme Court. Don't want to get too political, but I think we all kind of understand that that's sort of how our laws are sort of viewed and enforced. It's done through the judiciary system. Now, ADUs, you can't restrict them on non-conforming lots anymore. So even if it's a non-conforming lot, you can still have an ADU on there. And sort of what is a non-conforming lot? Well, maybe it's too small for a regular house, or it's, has a weird shape to it. Doesn't matter anymore. You can still put an ADU on that. Now, so talking about these municipalities and sort of their unreasonable restrictions, I think a lot of cities and towns don't necessarily like this, and that's just my opinion off of what I've seen. And they may be tweaking zoning and zoning laws and sort of building codes and things like that, just to kind of make it a little harder to do this. That's to be expected. Not everybody is going to like these laws. Some people don't want, some communities don't want like rental people. I mean, it is what it is. So I think we can see a little bit of pushback with that. And that's just sort of, again, it's too early to kind of really know so far. So we really want to kind of be patient with it. I still think these ADUs are a great idea. If you're on the fence of building one, my personal opinion is I think these are great. I think it provides everybody with a tremendous amount of options. And that's really all we're looking for from our government, in my opinion, is options. Give us options. Housing is expensive. Rent is expensive. If there's more apartments to be rented out, things are going to be cheaper. I also think not having sort of these restrictions or allowing towns to have these restrictions could allow for people to live in perhaps nicer communities. I don't think that would necessarily be a bad thing. Just my personal opinion. Now let's kind of talk about the cost of these, and that's really, you can make these as nice as you want. You can also just make them as simple as you need. And again, that just leads to the options on this. 900 square feet is plenty of living space for one person, maybe even two people. I lived in Salem, Mass for a little bit of time, and I think me and my wife were in a 600 square foot condo. So you might say 900 sounds small. I think that's more than enough space. And I think it's just overall, it's going to be very helpful. Now, if you're thinking about building one of these, a couple things you might want to consider. Definitely go to local zoning board meetings. Get a feel for how those sort of work. It's never a bad idea, I think, to check in on how local government works. And I believe the town meetings are televised on the station. It's always a good idea to kind of check in and kind of see what's going on. It's always good to kind of be informed with what's going on in your community. And I think that's a great idea. Not only for this issue, but I think for any issue. Kind of keep tabs on what's going on with your local community. It couldn't hurt. So if you're thinking about doing one, that's step one. Start going to these meetings. I would say even if you're thinking about it, start going to the zoning meetings. And, it's a good idea. It's a good excuse to kind of get out there. But also, you'll kind of see what other people are dealing with. You'll see how other people are addressing this issue. Is your community kind of pushing back on that? It's a great opportunity to learn that information. I always liked doing this. I do this for fun sometimes. Go to like these local meetings. When I was in law school and when I had my internship and even after, sometimes I would just go and watch court just to watch it. Like, you just learn by being there. And I think it's important. And I would also check the town's older municipalities, what their older laws on, like, for this were. Some towns were more restrictive, some of them were less. I think that might give you an idea of how things are working for this sort of thing, how much pushback you may have, or what your true options really are. And then you probably should talk to a developer, a builder, contractor, and get plans made up and figure out where you want to put it. Now that can go two ways. That can either be for the freestanding unit, or that can be converting a section of your house to meet these ADU requirements and to actually have sort of this in-law apartment in your house. And then you have it built, get it inspected, and if you want to rent it out, get a lease. cannot say this more. What is most important if you're renting out an ADU? Get a lease. It's the most important thing you can do. Trust me on this. Even if it's a family member, if they are paying you money, get a lease. And if they're paying you money, declare it on your taxes. Do not get yourself into trouble. Please, 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 please. If you have a question on this, please reach out. I'll make sure my email address is below. Email me if you have a question. Don't just sort of start taking money. Get a lease. Please get a lease. And that's pretty much it. Yeah, so kind of keep everything in mind here. So I think it's a good idea. Again, I think what this law is aiming to do is provide everybody with some options. And options, I think, will just make it easier for everybody. So hopefully you all found this enjoyable and a little educational and hopefully a little entertaining. I know I'm by myself today. Usually I like to have a guest. We could break this down more. If you know anything about ADUs and you want to come on this program and talk about it, please come on. We'll chat. Open invitation, please. All right, with that down, we will wrap things up here today. Again, my name is Ed Berkman. I am an attorney here in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And anything that you heard here today, anything that we talked about, please, it is just information. It is not legal advice. I am an attorney. I am not your attorney. Please reach out with your specific question. I'd be more than happy to answer it. All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you next time on another episode of The Common Law.